You might be wondering about my sermon title today, some things to take on our spaceship. And that's maybe because you haven't considered packing your bag for whatever the future holds in 2034 or 2049, whether it's Elon Musk's next big rocket project or reporting to serve on the Space Force or cryogenically freezing yourself so that you can come back in a couple hundred years. But anyway, I recently read this article in a Buddhist magazine called Lion's Roar by a man named John Tarrant, and it's an exercise in considering what might be best to take along on our spaceship were we to start over again. So he made a list of 12 things, and I'm going to share just a few of them with you briefly before I offer a few of my own. He would take along not knowing, being a Buddhist person, because he thinks that's what uncertainty feels like. Zen teachings, and I think Christian teachings too, are mysterious, changing who you are in ways that you can't imagine. The result of that kind of process is a new life, and there will always be lots of mass market teachings that make life smaller, but not knowing goes in the other direction and opens doors. He would also take panic, delusion, and desire because he thinks these dark kinds of materials come with us anyway, whether we try to leave them behind or not. Panic is what tells us we're alive. When we panic, the world might stop in just the same way it does when beauty appears. And in the timelessness brought on by a crisis, you realize that the universe is holding your life. Everything becomes connected and vast. Panicking or not panicking, they're both just life unfolding. He had some other more positive ones too. He said he would take along even very small stories, which are teachings. For example, here's a very small story. Once upon a time, a teacher said, "Everything is a good day." The end. And lastly, this author would take along love, because we can love our own lives when we're afraid, when we think we've done something stupid, and when others shame or attack us just as much as we can love ourselves when we know we've made the best choices. He also thinks we should take along rats, crows, trees, and stones, but I'll let you look up the article yourself if you want to see why he said that. I wonder what you would take. I've given this some thought, and I would definitely add creativity, forgiveness, dogs, and poems. But I'll come back to why I would add those in a minute. I chose the scripture for today from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians because it also makes me think about what we might need for building in the future. It makes me think about what we might need for building right now. I was drawn to the passage by verse 9, the verse that says, "We are God's fellow workers, you see. You are God's farm, God's building." If we understand, if we act in ways that show that we are working with God in creating a world that is growing and changing like a farm or a field, if we imagine we are creating together a dwelling where all of us are welcome and there's room enough for a wide range of practices and viewpoints and opinions, then I hope that means we're inspired to do our parts and to help other people do theirs to make it actually happen, even if we might not choose the exact same work. We all have different skills, we have different styles of doing things, different comfort levels with the risks that we take, and I'm glad that I don't need to know how the building fire suppression system works, or how to negotiate a land sale contract, or how to teach calculus to a teenager. I assume that some of you are glad you don't need to know how to prepare a sermon, or think up a crazy time with children, or serve on the periodic support consultation group of the association. I'm grateful that we can rely on each other for so many things, for the myriad things that we need to make the world happen. Last week, David and I went up to visit Emma, one of his daughters, at the College of the Atlantic in Bar Harbor, Maine. I haven't been on a college campus in a while, so it was kind of fun to see all the students eating together in their dining hall in little groups that come together and break apart and come together again. And they ate, by the way, all at once in the space of only an hour and a half, a purposely small window of time so that they're sure that everybody interacts with each other and sits together for dinner, which I thought was a really neat idea. It's kind of a luxury of a small school that they can do that, but what an excellent way to cultivate community. Anyway, on one of the nights that we were there, we went to the community dinner at the Congregational Church in Bar Harbor. And we sat at long tables that were mixed with students from the college and members and friends of the church and people from the town. And there was a student sitting across from us, and she was telling us about how she's on the planning committee for a very large building that they're building on the campus. And they've had a whole lot of planning meetings trying to decide what it's going to look like, by sorting out their priorities in terms of who they're going to be serving with the space and what they want, obviously, to happen there. And they're being very intentional about this project, including the concerns of everyone in the community. And if you look at the website for this community within Bar Harbor, the College of the Atlantic, you'll learn that each of their students designs their own course of study in human ecology. So they describe that as an exploration of relationships between humans and their natural, cultural, and built environments. And I think that's not really so different from what Paul understood his task to be when he said about gathering groups of people into church communities. He was setting up experiments in human ecology, the relationships between us, with each other, with our larger community, with the physical buildings we inhabit and the land that we steward. It's all very complex, obviously, and all a study in human ecology. And I think as Christians, part of our natural and cultural environment would include our relationship with God, certainly, a God who calls us to our primary purpose on this earth, which is to live in and continually build a world where now 8 billion people share very limited resources. So the question is always, how do we do this without driving each other nuts or even killing each other in the process? It takes lots of planning, lots of listening, oftentimes reworking the drawings, just as the student we had dinner with described to us as she told us how they had to make a number of compromises as they were doing their work. She wanted composting toilets throughout the whole building, but apparently that would require extensive network underneath the building, and that would mean raising up the building several feet. So there's not going to be composting toilets. I hope you're grasping my point, which is that in any big project, any planning for the future, whether you're making a building, building physical structures, or creating communities, or developing the political policies of countries, it requires input from everyone involved. We won't agree on everything. We may even have very different ideas for what is the best way to go, but we must be sure that everyone is present, engaged, or has a voice in the process. I was reading another article in the same magazine, this issue of Lion's Roar, written by Krista Tippett, who writes the On Being podcast that I've often referenced to you because I think it's such a good one to listen to. She writes that there's a great deal of growth and healing taking place all around us, but that she feels like her fellow journalists aren't so quick to write about it amid all the turmoil and struggle and destruction that we read about in the newspapers. She also says that we've begun to push our spiritual lives into this area that we call private, preferring instead to place our faith in sort of the large, loud, external pursuits of politics and economics, but she's not too sure where that's gotten us all. So she wrote this article for the magazine because she sees seeds in Buddhist practice that are good tools for us. And for example, she wrote, sitting with, letting everything arise, allowing discomfort, which are Buddhist practices. These are spiritual and moral muscles for when the work of being curious comes about, when we might gently mistrust that exhilarating feeling when suffering hardens into hatefulness and feels momentarily like power, because we don't know how to sit with or stand before pain or fear or suffering, which tends to land in the middle of our lives together, so that we have a chance to soften. We don't know how to greet them as part of our wholeness and as a potential source of compassion. Instead, we get real skilled at taking refuge in outrage. I think that's unfortunately the truth, and I think Paul is saying the same thing, that we easily devolve into being spiritually immature people who struggle to offer one another even the most basic things, like listening without speaking, or encouraging expressions of emotion, even if it makes us uncomfortable, or compassion for those in situations that we really just don't understand. And speaking of compassion for things we don't understand, I'm sad to report that after a 3-day special session of the General Conference meeting in St. Louis, the United Methodist Church voted 438 votes to 384 votes in favor of the traditional plan, which affirms the church's current bans on ordaining lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender clergy and officiating at same-sex marriages. So this means that no person who identifies as gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, or queer will be allowed to serve churches as ordained clergy. And no one at all will be allowed to preside at a same-sex wedding. After the meeting was over, some said that that decision would become a virus that will make the United Methodist Church in this country very sick, and they speculate that many pastors are going to leave and that even an annual conference or two may leave. There might be trials, and they'll be on the news, and the only thing about the church that people will hear about is who they're not serving. And I'm sad, not just because I can't reconcile the message of Christ with the outcome of that vote, but because of the pain that is reverberating all over the country right now for all those individuals and churches who have now been told that they're not welcome to be a part of the church. It seems to me that this behavior is immature in the same way Paul describes in his letter to the Corinthians. He's trying to make clear to people in the early church that though they thought they were dealing with important matters, they're really just getting caught up in gossip and personality conflicts. He didn't offer them deeper teaching because he didn't think they were ready for it. They're fighting over something that they don't even control. They're inserting their human opinions on matters about which only God can speak. I wonder if we're doing that right now. But here we are, standing in God's field or sitting in God's church, trying to figure out how to build a future together. How do we make it through when we hit an impasse like the one I just described to you at that United Methodist meeting, or the one we might be experiencing here in this congregation? I said earlier that I'd be sure to take along on our spaceship creativity, forgiveness, dogs, and poems. And that's because I find all those things pretty helpful when facing just about anything in my life. And the truth is, we're already on the spaceship. It's this spinning blue marble we already inhabit. And the lists of what to bring are long, but luckily there's plenty of room inside the human heart and on this planet to have everything we need. Because, of course, we already have every tool, every skill, all the practices, all the gifts of the Holy Spirit that we'll need. Many of them are very well used and reliable, like faith and hope and love and creativity and forgiveness and dogs and poems and not knowing and panic and small stories, we can bring all of it. It's scary to let ourselves soften enough in places to be vulnerable and sit in the discomfort and the pain and the fear that so often comes between us. But that is precisely what God calls us to do, because we are fellow workers standing in a field with God. The good news is that we get to build something together that's meant to last. And it's not a building or an idea, but a community that lives and grows and prays together. We need everyone to participate. We have the best foundation there is, the love and forgiveness that underlay all the teachings of Jesus. And we have the best contractor in the universe, a God who is making all things new. Amen.